Good afternoon. My name is Gayane Torosyan. I'm presenting here today with my colleague, Dr. Brian Lowe. Our topic is inoculating students against disinformation in a post-truth society, teaching first-year undergrad students about disinformation. A few words about ourselves. Dr. Brian Lowe is a faculty member, a full professor in the Department of Sociology at SUNY Oneonta, as you can see from the red dragon. Cortland and Oneonta share the dragon symbol. And I am Gayane Torosyan, as I mentioned. I teach in the Communication and Media Department. So a little bit of a history of what we're doing here. Brian and I have been collaborating on many different projects in the past, but starting from last semester, from the fall of 2023, our institution began a series of first-year seminars aimed at informing our students on the global north, global south dynamic and raising global awareness along with critical thinking. So faculty members were invited to create seminar topics, all within the rubric of Dragon 1000, Red Dragon 1000. So it's a first-year seminar, and students were handpicked and placed by admissions into those seminars, encourages critical thinking, interdisciplinary thinking. Unfortunately, this topic of misinformation or disinformation happens to be an ongoing problem, and alerting our students to the existence of disinformation, falsities, and lies has become a necessity in the society that Brian and other sociologists, Brian Lowe, my colleague, call post-truth. We live in a post-truth society. So we used two textbooks for this class. One is Sander van der Linden's Foolproof: Why Misinformation Affects Your Mind and How to Build Immunity. I have the book right here in front of me, but you also see it there. And Professor Lowe, Dr. Lowe, has tried contacting van der Linden because we take pride in the fact that SUNY Oneonta was the place where digital learning, this gathering originated. So he wanted van der Linden to join us if he could. He's a social psychologist at the University of Cambridge, a pretty, well, I could say, relatively up and coming researcher, consultant to the British government on disinformation. The central thesis of the book Foolproof is the analogy of inoculation, physical inoculation, medical inoculation, to the inoculation of people's minds. Just the same way as vaccination helps prevent us from specific diseases, people can be inoculated against misinformation and disinformation. The second book we use in the class is written by Lee McIntyre. He's also a very popular author and frequent speaker on different media platforms. It's called On Disinformation: How to Fight for Truth and Protect Our Democracy. Now, this book is really easy to read and finish in about half an hour or an hour. It's a small formatted book. But what really, stopped me from making, or stopped us from making this a central document, a central text for the class, is that it is leaning towards the left. It talks about democracy. How dare we? But van der Linden is speaking from a social psychological perspective, and he's using very broad approaches to how the public receives and shares information in the digital era. Van der Linden also looks at history and dating back to the Roman emperors, to Julius Caesar's times. That's where disinformation originated, apparently. And then moving on to Catherine the Great in Russia, also using disinformation. and becoming a victim of disinformation in the Russian society, in the Soviet Union. Catherine the Great was stereotyped as someone, somewhat of a nymphomaniac. So the thesis on disinformation is that disinformation is not primarily intended to promote a specific idea or a specific agenda, but the agenda actually is to create disorientation and distraction from what happens to be true or what is factual. McIntyre calls these people who practice disinformation or spread disinformation truth killers. The rationale is to confuse and disorient the population, making them thus easier to manipulate. So the case studies that we use in the class are COVID-19 conspiracy theories, including attacks on 5G towers, physical attacks, the Pizzagate urban legend, or the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, and QAnon as an organization, which is based on conspiracy theories itself. So on this screen, we see a 5G tower that is destroyed by conspiracy theorists who are claiming that these cell towers are the mechanisms through which the COVID virus is actually spreading. And there was a story in the New York Times dated April 11, 2020, when conspiracy theorists blamed the cell towers, the physical towers, for spreading the virus. And I know my colleague Brian Lowe would have wanted to talk about this. Brian, if you're here, you can jump in at any point.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I apologize, ladies and gentlemen. My machine decided to do a hard update. And I'd like to say, in the spirit of disinformation, that this was to silence our presentation so you wouldn't find out what we wanted to share with you, but that's probably not the case. So thank you very much. I apologize for this. And Gayane, are you driving this right now?
I am driving. I was going to text
Okay.
you. Tell me when to click. Just tell me.
Okay. So this, as you heard, is an image of a cell phone or a cell tower attacked in April of 2020 in the UK. Next slide, please. Another of the cases that we examine is Pizzagate. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Pizzagate involved a conspiracy theory around Comic Ping Pong, which is a family-oriented pizza restaurant in Northern Virginia that got enveloped in this conspiracy theory that it was actually a hub of some kind of child sex trafficking. And Edgar Welch became so obsessed with this theory that he traveled over 6 hours from his home in North Carolina to Northern Virginia to, as he put it, self-investigate. He was armed, he discharged his weapon. Ultimately, he surrendered to police and was imprisoned for 4 years. Next slide, please. But beyond just individuals like Mr. Welch, who were effectively radicalized by Pizzagate, we had others promoting this. What you're looking at right now is a slide from Michael Flynn Jr., son of former General Michael Flynn, who was also very briefly a, pardon me, President Trump's national security advisor. And we use evidence like this to demonstrate to our students that it isn't just marginalized people that are promoting conspiracy theories. Next slide, please. Another case that van der Linden examines, we discuss as well, is QAnon. And if you're unfamiliar with QAnon, I highly recommend, and this is in our references at the end of our presentation, that you look at this 2022 Public Religion Research Institute survey. But the beliefs of QAnon are really agreement with 3 claims. The first is that government, and primarily government, media, and other elites are in fact part of a satanic child trafficking cabal. Secondly, that a storm is imminent that will appear and sweep away these elites in power, the storm essentially being code for revolution. And then related to that, pardon me, is the third point that violence may be necessary in the future because things have gotten so far off track. Next slide, please. And the way that PRRI organized the responses is between those that are believers who partly or completely agree, and then doubters and rejectors. And as you can see, next slide, please. That while the majority of respondents to all three questions reject QAnon, at least 15% of respondents either completely or mostly agreed with all of those. So just giving you a sense of the magnitude of the beliefs of, or the hold of QAnon in America. And that was 2022. Next slide, please. But we also looked at Lee McIntyre's on disinformation. We look at science denial in the case of big tobacco, denial as a source of identity, and disproportionate sources of disinformation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the case of the tobacco industry, how the tobacco industry very deliberately cultivated uncertainty, in particular through the establishment of an organization, the TIRC, or the Tobacco Industry Research Council, that met in December of 1953, and one of its first actions was to release this document, next slide please, called A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers. This is from the Center for Tobacco-Free Kids. And this was published in all American newspapers with a readership of 50,000 or more, excluding predominantly African-American readership newspapers. But this was intended and was quite successful for decades for generating uncertainty about the relationship between smoking and health. Next slide, please. But then we consider denial as a source of identity, and we turn to a terrific concept by David Roberts of tribal epistemology. That is asking how holding knowledge can make you part of a group. So one example that we point students to involves a 2006 survey of Hungarians. And amongst other findings, the survey pointed out that 2/3 of respondents were opposed to the Perez people, or the Perezians, which raises the question, why are the Perezian people so unpopular? Next slide, please. Well, sociologist Andrei Sick invented the Parisian people, and he argues this is indicative of a high level of xenophobia that we find in 21st century Hungary. And it, of course, raises the question, why did 2/3 of respondents feel the need to show hostility toward a non-existent group? Next slide, please. From McIntyre, we discuss the big lie, that is that Trump actually won the 2020 election. And McIntyre cites a fantastic article by Jane Mayer about the big money and organizations, including the Brady Foundation and Turning Point USA, that are pushing this particular conspiracy theory, but also how individuals can have a role. Thank you. This is a report. No, please go ahead. Thank you. This is from the Disinformation Dozen. This is a report from the Center for Countering Digital Hate that points out that the majority of anti-vaccination claims can be, that reach more than 59 million followers, can be traced back to 12 individuals, which, next slide, please, are identified. Although, to be fair, number 3, as you can see, is a married couple. But we want our students to be aware that some of the vast disinformation can actually be attributed to a relatively small network of activists. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? How do we try and engage our students critically with disinformation? Well, one way, of course, we do this, and this is somewhat conventional, is that we have brief response assignments where the students are asked to write brief essays that are involved or applying data from class and applying them to various topics. We also have been trying to have our students generate an archive of what they have found disinformation, because as we learn every class, they are digital natives, and we are not. So we are trying to use that to everyone's collective advantage and having students find examples in both mass media and on social media of examples of disinformation and to place those in a common archive. Next slide, please. We conclude the class with having students in small groups conduct a near future simulation where they are speaking to us from decades in the future and how they and their future selves have responded to disinformation, and their responses are to be based on historical examples and contemporary data. Next slide, please. Thank you. But whenever we have a chance, we try to lighten the mood a little bit, and we do this through bad news. Next slide, please. And I believe one of our co-conspirators, Mr. Ed Beck, was kind enough to place a link in the chat so you can learn a bit more about Open Lab. The bad news game came out of van der Linden's social decision-making lab, and this was created really as an implement of mass inoculation. Next slide, please. And the idea, and you have this link now if you want to check this out on your own. And by playing this game, not only is it a bit of fun, but for students, it really helps put a critical eye towards this inoculation thesis. Can we, through exercises like this, help develop a kind of mass herd immunity to disinformation? So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. I apologize again for being tardy. I would blame Dell, but I need this laptop for the next few minutes, so I will hold my tongue. But I want to thank my esteemed colleague for saving the day, and I would be personally very interested in hearing your responses and any questions that you might have. So thank you for your kind attention.
I would also add my thanks to Ed Beck for creating the Open Lab space for our ongoing teaching. We're using the Open Lab in two sections of the class, one taught with Brian and myself. The other one is just my section. We both use Open Lab, and Ed Beck has been amazingly helpful. Thank you, Ed. Am I muted?
No, no. Ed, you can take a bow if you like.
So if anybody has any questions, please post them into the chat. We're a small enough group to where you could turn on your video and unmute yourself. We do have another minute or so, and then we'll take a quick break, and then we have the keynote.
I'd love to know how the this may be a question more for Ed than for the two of you, but how that database was built in Open Lab. What's the database construction tool plugin?
Yeah, happy to share that. It's actually just a WordPress website
Right.
where all of the students are contributing there as authors. By doing it through the Open Lab, they first have to sign up for the Open Lab, but then as authors, they can contribute to that database. and then we can make that filterable and sortable by having different categories placed on each of the different posts. What we did was we created a gravity form so that they could submit their disinformation throughout there. So they kind of have a guided form that they go through that lets them click the right check boxes, add citations in, so that each of the entries kind of has the same look and feel, and also so that then it can be tagged and sortable from the front end.
Thank you. So it's a form, it's gravity form. That's great.
Yep, a gravity form with an advanced post creation workflow so that form entries instantly become the posts on the site.
So great, thank you, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. Appreciate you